Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'm sure you stayed up late last night and studying, doing your homework, and watching the debate. And I guess we'll talk a little bit about that. But, of course, the interesting thing about going into that debate was the whole clamor about the tape that was released on Trump. And, of course, there were some pretty nasty sounding things and bad language and everything else. And people acted like, I'm shocked. and, you know, how could anybody be shocked, especially since Trump's might have been more honest and straightforward with his straightforward accusations. So I don't think anybody should be shocked. But I think it's a very bipartisan thing that candidates and presidents have used. I guess Nixon used pretty vile language as well. But, you know, he used a lot of language, but to me, I was fascinated with how people were scurrying around. You know, the Trump people, oh, that's no big deal. You know, big deal. Bill Clinton did this, and you know, and try to spin it a certain way. Then, of course, the Hillary people said, you know, this is the disqualifying thing. He said something 11 years ago, and it was mean and nasty. They never charged him with a violent act, which I thought was pretty important. Probably the independents are out there. I don't know. I can't believe there's anybody independent anymore in this race. Which way should we go? Is this a deciding factor? Is it Hillary's dishonesty versus Trump bombastic language and foul language? Which is the most important? But, you know, I feel pretty comfortable because I have a bit time ago made a decision that I can't stand either one of them, and I don't have to decide on this, but it's sort of one of those things that is important. We're talking about personal character, but I think we'll talk a little bit about personal character and what it means, but also the policies that people have. Personal character is very important, but what about the atrocious policies versus the atrocious language and personal habits? Big difference, and I know that there was a little mention last night about immigration and a little bit on foreign policy in Syria. So, did anything happen last night that changed your mind about these two candidates?
It was funny. I followed when some of the revelations came about this conversation that Trump apparently had in private with someone that was pretty crude, honestly. And but on Twitter, most of the people were anticipating what the debate would be, and they were right, which is it would start out with this salacious material, and we wouldn't be talking about so many of the other most important things. You know, of course, the character counts, but the issues, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Afghanistan. Your column today is about Afghanistan, 15 years of war. You know, about the economy in the tank. You know, but nope.
15 years ago, Trump said this.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what it led with. So,
yeah, you know, there was a little bit of discussion about how these debates run. Since I approach this so often that the two parties aren't different, you end up with the same things. There's a fight over power, but they want to decide always who wins, and there seems to be a consensus. The first one. Hillary won by a landslide. Trump's over with. And, you know, I looked at it. It must be that I don't see it from their same viewpoint. Well, they were both terrible. I didn't hear anything I liked, but Hillary won. So I figured, well, they're experts on this media stuff. But this time around, I mean, Trump settled down, had it together, overcame those tapes, and he ran away with it, and he won it. But could it be could they conspire, the media and a whole bunch of them, conspire that this is nothing more than mocking the people, pretending there's a game going on. So we have to have even Stevens, one here, now, the runoff debate before the election, and more, instead of less people watching this stuff, there'll be more people than ever. But that's probably over the top on conspiracy thinking.
It kind of reminds you of watching the U.S. Open, you know, in the finals. You want your tennis player to win, But you don't want them to do it in straight sets. You want to see that third set. You want to see it go 7-6 and go on, and that's probably, and it's good for selling soap and all the other sorts of things that they do. So, one of the things that, getting to the issues, because there's plenty about the character, but one of the things that jumped out, if you don't mind me mentioning, is, of course, the whole Hillary campaign seems to be Trump is sexist toward women, and he's racist. And so if you want to elect a racist and a sexist, then vote for him. And that's kind of unsatisfying, because those may be true in a way, but there are other issues. And it did come up about immigration, and the issue was Trump's ban on Muslim immigration before we know who the heck is coming in. He used more colorful words than that. And Hillary made a point that I thought was a good point. It's important for us as a policy not to say we're going to ban people just because of their religion. And I think that is a good point. The criteria for immigrating into the U.S. shouldn't be religion or country of origin or other things, but you would have other much more stringent barriers to people immigrating to the U.S.
Yeah, well, first off, I don't like putting people in groups. I think that's one of the worst things. The media does it. The politicians do it. Everybody talks about, Hispanics and the blacks and the women. Everybody has different roles. What are you going to do for the women? It disgusts me about, I can do more for the women than anybody else. Well, it should be an insult. Why do the women need so much help? I'm going to do more for the black people. Well, why do they need so much help? Walter Williams is great on this.
Yeah.
It's an insult. He takes it personally as an insult, being a black man, that he needs black leaders and black politicians to take care of them, that they should be individuals. They're important as individuals. In a way, this is an overlap into, Christianity. People are important because they have a soul, and they have to make an individual decision. But here, it's always group. And there's a reason, of course, sometimes why they do this is because people have been punished because they've been in a group,
Sure.
But then they think the solution is special privileges and special favors for the different groups. And there's a lot of talk about that. And Hillary's great at it. But it disappoints me that once again, I never heard the word liberty, Maybe it came out, but I missed it. But no, they're not talking about liberty and the protection. Even when they talked about the Supreme Court justices, they didn't talk about somebody, a strict constitutionalist, looking at Article 1, Section 8. What should the role of government be? Should the government be there to be the safety net for everybody and anything? No, the government has to do this. We're looking under policy. Hillary wants somebody that's going to have this type of policy, that would endorse Obamacare, this kind of stuff. So that to me was disappointing once again that they don't talk about it. And quite frankly, even though their foreign policies are a little bit different, they're both authoritarians. They both want to use power. They both want to increase the money into the military. They don't talk about peace. They talk about toughness. And I can do more against ISIS than the other person can. And the whole reason is the Democrats won't admit that there's Islamic radical terrorism. If they would only say that, it would solve the problem.
Magic.
But do they ever talk about possibly a religious element in those in this country who advocate all these wars? Are they not participating in this thing? If they drop drone missiles on funerals and kill innocent people to the tune of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Some people estimate 1 million people have died because of our interventions over there. So I think they're missing the whole point about using words. But both of them use fear.
Yeah.
If you look at that in foreign policy, they can do this and that. And Hillary's foreign policy of no-fly zones and all these other things, it is so interventionist. But I think they're both interventionists. One is a nationalist who uses force to intervene for making America the greatest, exceptionalism and this sort of thing. And she's an internationalist doing the same thing. And but nobody said, I was waiting for him to say, what's the solution to Syria? Well, bring the troops home. They didn't say that.
I hope you weren't holding your breath because it would have been a bad thing. The thing that shocked me, we talk about the Syria, because that was a good part of the debate, a large chunk. I was shocked at how ill-informed or deceptive both candidates are. Either their advisors are telling them really nothing about reality, or they're purposely obfuscating what's really happening. And Hillary said, these are more or less quotes, "There is a determined effort by the Russian Air Force to destroy Aleppo in order to eliminate the last of the Syrian rebels who are holding out against the Syrian regime." And that makes these rebels sound like, brave people holding out against the regime. But surely she knows, because the Obama administration itself has admitted on numerous occasions that the rebels holding eastern Aleppo are al-Qaeda. And actually, as of yesterday, an ISIS flag went up on a hill in East Aleppo. So these aren't brave rebels, and she knows it. These are al-Qaeda, and these are ISIS. The other thing about attacking the city, which is a horrible thing, nobody will say it's wonderful that they're attacking the city. It's a horrible thing, but it certainly isn't unprecedented. Look at Fallujah, where we destroyed it at least twice to get out the Iraqi rebels. So there's just no sense of history.
Yeah, when I hear that, it seems like she's setting the stage for the next war.
Yeah.
It's Russia. Russia did this, but Trump participates in it because when it comes to he has one position with Syria, and it's better than Hillary's. But then another position of saying, well, let's continue the coup of 1953 to put in the Shah, and we have to get rid of those radicals in Iran, even though they were better off now with talking to people. And so this to me is very discouraging, but it confuses the people because they don't know where it's seeing. But I will give Trump a little bit of credit. Although overall policy, he doesn't reassure me. But the fact that he challenged his vice presidential candidate, well, I don't agree with that, and passed on to that. Well, because he's against, us starting the bombing over there, and Hillary wanted to. But there's still all this effort to try to build up another enemy. They can't stand the thought of peace breaking out, and if you look at what we have done and intervened and been involved in, how many civilians have died at our hands, and they're a little bit worried about the so-called legalizing our ability, or the victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia. They're terrified that they could sue us, because some people died at our hands. And what some people have said, not too many Americans, although there's some Americans that Bush committed war crimes. So now they're starting to, hey, maybe we moved too fast on this. And, what are we going to do now? Which is rather ironic.
Yeah. And, Trump was also, apparently, to me at least, so ill-informed about Syria. I wonder who advises him on this, because Hillary opened the door to a great retort, but he gets it so confused, like you said, and so wrong. He on one hand, he praises the Russians. They're bombing the heck out of ISIS. That's great. And then he attacks Iran, which is also bombing the heck out of ISIS, is attacking ISIS, is very actively involved in fighting ISIS. And he says it's all our fault that Iran is strong. And it doesn't make any sense. And the other thing he said, oh, well, this is all your fault, Hillary, because we haven't modernized our nukes yet. We need $1 trillion. But I will say he said one thing that was good, and if he were smarter, had better advisors, I think he would develop this, because she's going on about these glorious rebels that we have to save, and he comes back with, she doesn't even know who these rebels are. Every time we take rebels, whether Iraq or elsewhere, we're arming people. And you know what happens? They end up being worse than the people before. Look what she did in Libya with Gaddafi. That's a good sentiment. He needs to build on that.
Like, look at every place we've been.
I
mean, where have we created any great democratic system where they argue for peace and prosperity and free markets? I mean, it hasn't existed. It's always been more chaotic because we're using violence to try to impose our will, and we're seen as outsiders. So even if somebody there was sympathetic, matter of fact, what happens if there are factions sympathetic to maybe the Western way of life, once we get involved, they have to become unified, and they tend to agree with the people who say they're invaders. You know, and that's how they get the moral high ground. I think there was a bit of that in Vietnam. We didn't win because we were the invaders. We came a long way off, and we were killing a lot of people. But that seems to be the case, you know, whether it's in Egypt or Libya or any of these countries that we get involved and do nothing more than cause more antagonism.
And even Afghanistan, Obama, as you pointed out, he called it the good war. And now 15 years later, the Taliban control so much territory. They control the countryside. You know, in terms of territory-wise, they control, you know, a lot of the country, and it's in far worse shape. How can anyone argue that it's been a success? And in fact, we are losing.
Yeah. But of course, the other word I used was the forgotten war.
Yeah.
I just wonder if somebody did a man in the street interview with people, honestly, a man in the street interview, find out how many people, whether they know about where Aleppo is, but really, what the history of in the last 15 years has been, you know, in Afghanistan. I mean, it's just astounding that we put up with this. But the members of Congress, just as, you know, remember the attitude they had when they were giving the authority to the president to go into Iraq. Of course, he already went into Afghanistan on his own, you know, and started that war, and it's ongoing. And I understand it costs a little bit of money, too. I mean, that's contributing to it. And we wear out the weapons. It just really makes those arms manufacturers so nervous. They're wearing out our weapons. Oh, okay. And you have both sides saying, we need to really, really rebuild the military because you can't ever tell when they're going to invade our country. But that's beside the point. They're not worrying about invasion. They're worrying about our interests, our national security interests being attacked, which means that we might be challenged in one of these countries that we're occupying. Maybe Assad will find an ally and defend his city and defend his country, you know, regardless of all the other pros and cons on that. Nobody realizes that we're on the wrong side of that. Yeah. And when you think of 2011, you know, what happened in Libya and then Syria, and it's ongoing, and now the troops are being added to these areas. So I didn't see the answers coming out last night, so I guess we have to keep our fingers crossed, but keep working harder.
You know, the other thing, if you don't mind, that I noticed was Hillary came out and said to the American people, the Russians are fixing the election in favor of Trump, and she was very, very bold, 2 or 3 times, and it was very strong. And here's one thing that she said. We have never in history of our country been in a situation where an adversary, a foreign power, is working so hard to influence the outcome of the elections. Believe me, they don't want me to win, to be elected. And she's very interesting. We put up a piece by Peter Van Buren on our site, who we know very well, and he had a great point that really someone is working to fix the elections, and it's not the Russian government, it's the U.S. government. Because he points out that the Director of National Intelligence, just a couple of days before this debate, you remember the end of last week, came out with a statement saying the Russians did it. The Russians hacked the DNC. And here's what he offered as his conclusive proof that they did. The recent hacked email disclosures are consistent with methods and motivations of Russian directed efforts. Is that a smoking gun? That's not even a squirt gun.
Yeah. But you know what would be an interesting statistic if somebody could dig up and find out every time our CIA was involved in manipulating elections around the world, all the way back to Diem in Vietnam and other places. Matter of fact, in Central America, even before that, for 100 years, we've been involved in setting up dictators. I mean, that's the American tradition. That must be what we call American exceptionalism. we can set up governments any place that we want.
Well, remember that there's the Time magazine that ran after the second Yeltsin election that had a picture of the buffoonish-looking Yeltsin, and it said, "Yanks to the rescue." And the subtitle was something about how Americans helped to re-elect Yeltsin, if that's not interference. But, you know, Peter points out, why would the Russians risk a cyber war with the U.S. to put Trump in office? Because Trump, you know, has, as you've pointed out many times, neocon tendencies. He's a hothead. You pointed out he's likely to put his finger on the button, where for all of Hillary's bluster, she's a career politician. She's somewhat of a realist. She's a known. You would think that the Russians would hedge their bets on a known rather than a hothead. So it's not you know, prima facie, it's not obvious that they would want to have Trump elected in the first place.
For those individuals out there who still believe that the neocons have drifted over and been open, the Bushes endorsing Hillary, that's pretty significant. But, Trump has a little bit of neocon support, and it continues to grow. Yeah. So the evidence is there. So if they question what you're saying, they ought to go and look and just find out how many individuals that are considered neocons. And he's not a guy that's saying bring the troops home. He wants to be a tough person. Yeah. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Liberty Report today. And obviously, the debate is important. The whole issue is important. But overall, I don't think it's going to change much after the election because a lot of things are in motion. There's a lot of momentum on economic terms, and they're not going to bring the troops home. We're going to continue to dig in. I think it's super Vietnam policy. That is, the worst things get, send more troops. I mean, this is what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're still, in Syria and all these places. But, the one question I want to make a point, and I mentioned this, is does atrocious personal behavior, bad language, meanness, and all these things that are personality traits, no, I don't like it. And if all things were equal, I would vote for a person that I liked and that talked decently and was not rude and crude. But that isn't exactly the case, because I think if somebody does that, but they had decent policy that were much more favorable to peace, I might say, well, the personal stuff I'll set across here, but as long as they'll work for peace and not subsidize the military-industrial complex, that is a different story. But what I complain about the most is the atrocious political governmental actions, because that is what really kills a lot of people. That is violence at its worst. And unfortunately, in my lifetime, it's been bipartisan, and I think it's bipartisan right now. Some people think that one reason Republicans don't like Trump is they think he might not be militant enough, and yet there's evidence to the contrary. But no, I think by far the obnoxious, atrocious behavior of government is much, much worse than this misbehavior as an individual on what he says and how he talks, which is very bipartisan, by the way. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.